Our opening session really, this morning for the whole day is called Democracy Today, Ancient Lessons, Modern Challenges. We've put together a panel of 5 speakers who will speak in 2 separate sessions with the mandatory coffee break coming along after the third speaker to break up the morning. And I'd just like to introduce the session with a few reflections on the concept of democracy in American history. When our former member, James Madison, wrote his famous 10th Federalist essay in November 1787, he tried to purge the concept of democracy from the American political vocabulary. By a pure democracy, Madison wrote, I mean a small society consisting of a small number of citizens who assemble and administer the government in person. That description could work well for the city-states of ancient Greece or early modern Italy, but it would never apply to the extended Republic of the United States, or even to most, or even all of its original member states, with the possible exception of Rhode Island, known then as the proverbial home of Jews, Turks, and infidels. Yet Madison's effort to limit or restrict the use of the word democracy failed. Even in the 1780s, many Americans were already using the term democratic or democratical to describe the popular branches of their Republican governments. They assumed that a proper representative assembly would be a mirror or a miniature or a portrait or a transcript of the larger society. It should literally represent the people for deliberative purposes. By our standards, I should say by our 21st century standards, their notions of who would appear in this mirror miniature may seem limited or even biased. But for the 18th century, they were actually fairly advanced and very progressive. Americans did not consciously imagine themselves being engaged in the process of creating what we would now call a democratic culture. But their belief that a popular government needed strong democratic elements was nevertheless one foundation for the development of that culture. When Alexis de Tocqueville conducted his famous tour of the United States half a century after Madison wrote Federalist 10, his mission was not merely to describe a set of political practices and institutions, but also to make sense of an entire culture that was becoming pervasively democratic. That is why his 2 volumes discussing democracy in America remain a landmark work of modern social science, a definitive effort to determine what a democratic culture actually meant and how one would go about describing its operations. Today, we inhabit a world where democracy, if not mortally imperiled the way it seemed to be in the 1930s, nevertheless faces some extraordinary challenges. This audience is, of course, old enough to realize how preposterous such a concern would have been a mere 3 decades ago, when the Soviet Union was teetering, or one could say veering towards collapse, and even the People's Republic of China was facing its own incipient democratic unrest. Today, we awake almost daily to wonder about the strength of authoritarian tendencies in many nations overseas, and frankly, to worry about their presence at home as well. One source of our unease is made so manifestly obvious with each day's news and tweets and outrageous outbursts that it barely warrants serious discussion. But the debilities in our body politic, the very fact that we now worry about how democracies fail or whether fascistic tendencies are infecting the population, requires us to think in more substantive terms about the structure and mechanics of our democratic system. So this morning's panel will address these contemporary concerns under 3 broad headings. First, the nature of democratic deliberations from its origins in classical antiquity. Second, 2 of the real-time challenges our own democracy has just been facing. And finally, the way in which our ideas of how markets operate relate to the democratic character of our citizens. Under the first heading, our first 2 speakers, Teresa Bijan and Jim Fishkin, will put Madison's caution against ancient democracy aside and draw some intriguing morals and applications from the realm of antiquity. Both of their talks will discuss issues of free speech and democratic deliberation, the critical form of political behavior that we can fairly regard as the lifeblood of any functioning democracy. Under the second heading, Kathleen Hall Jamieson, and I have flipped the page here, and Nicholas Stephanopoulos will consider 2 insidious practices that threaten the viability of our own democratic system. The Russian interference with our last election and potentially or presumably the next one, and the role of gerrymandering in distorting our mechanisms of representation and therefore of deliberation as well. Finally, Zephyr Teachout will shift our focus from politics to the economy and suggest that a vigorous anti-monopoly policy that would foster creativity in the marketplace would also be conducive to the moral development of democratic citizens. So let me briefly outline the proceedings. So we'll go in the usual way. We'll have 5 20-minute presentations, 3, coffee break 2. We're going to try to allow or save a couple minutes for 1 or 2 questions after each participant has spoken something, but we intend to round up the morning with the kind of general round table up here that I'll moderate, where all the speakers will come up, and then we'll open that up to the audience. So our first speaker this morning is Teresa Bijan. Teresa Bijan is Associate Professor of Political Theory and a Fellow of Oriel College at the University of Oxford. She received her PhD with distinction from Yale University in 2013 and holds previous degrees from the Universities of Chicago and Cambridge. In 2015, her dissertation was awarded the Leo Strauss Award from the American Political Science Association for the best doctoral dissertation in political philosophy. Dr. Bijan's research brings perspectives from early modern political thought to bear on pressing questions in contemporary political theory. She has published widely in peer-reviewed journals, edited volumes in popular venues, including The Atlantic and The Washington Post. Her first book, Mere Civility, Disagreement and the Limits of Toleration, was published in 2017 by Harvard University Press and examines contemporary calls for civility in light of 17th century debates about religious toleration. And I won't embarrass Teresa too much, but among the books I've read in recent years, this is one of the very smartest that I've encountered. And if anyone here has a serious academic interest in issues of free speech, it's a great place to think historically and contemporaneously about the issues we faced. In 2016, Dr. Bijan was elected the 7th and final Balzan Skinner Fellow in Modern Intellectual History at the University of Cambridge. She's currently on leave from Oxford on a Leverhulme Research Fellowship to work on her next book, which explores early modern ideas and practices of equality before egalitarianism. So thanks very much, and let the proceedings begin.